Ultra processed foods have come up a couple times. Let's take that from the angle of blood sugar. When we eat those, our blood sugar is going to spike, and oftentimes you're going to have a crash afterward. Let's connect that to hunger.
Oh yeah, that's actually been known. I actually looked at this study. It was from the 70s. Actually, they looked at the processing of foods, and what they find is that the speed with which glucose rises. So remember, carbohydrates are chains of glucose. Okay, so if you have bread or rice or potatoes, they're made of a molecule called either amylopectin or amylose, and that's the way that one is highly branched and one is linear. So any potatoes, rice, whatever, they're all carbohydrates, which are amylopectin and amylose, which are chains of glucose, all arranged in a long chain. When your body gets it, it will chop that chain of glucose into glucose and then it'll go up. Now, if you have a carbohydrate that's slow to digest, then the rise in glucose is going to be, it'll still go up, but it'll go up slowly and gradually. That's not so bad. What's really bad is when you have this huge spike of glucose that goes up. Then what happens is it forces your body to spike the insulin because insulin is what, follows, right? It takes the glucose and it pushes it into the cells for it to use its energy. But this really super high spike like that, it's your body really can't handle it very well. So what happens is that it tends to overshoot. So not only do you get this big spike in glucose followed by this spike in insulin, it forces so much glucose in that it goes down below normal. So now your glucose is going down below normal, which is called hypoglycemia, which can stimulate shaking and extreme hunger. So this is what happens when you eat sort of white bread and jam in the morning, which is basically pure carbohydrate and pure ultra processed carbohydrate. So if you eat these ultra processed carbohydrates and you're getting these massive spikes, then you simply can't handle it. And then by 10:30, when it goes too low, you're getting hungry. So by 10:30, you simply can't. You need to eat something. You're getting shaky. You're getting hangry, and all this sort of stuff. Now, if you had eaten the same carbohydrate, same amount of carbohydrate, but in a sort of slow, gradual movement, so you can do this by eating less processed carbohydrates. So, if it has a lot of fiber, for example, it's going to slow it down. If you're going to eat the carbohydrate with other things, such as vinegar, for example, it tends to slow it down. So if you get this sort of more gradual, you don't get this big drop in where you get the hypoglycemic hunger. So the refined carbohydrates tend to be very, very bad. And this is one of the when we're talking about ultra processed foods, many of us understand that they're bad, and they're bad for a number of reasons, including a lot of the chemicals that they add, right? So the flavor enhancers, the texturizers, the emulsifiers, all those sort of things are actually designed to stimulate hunger rather than, satiety. But the other thing is that refined carbohydrates in particular are very bad. Refined, fats and refined proteins may or may not be bad. I still think they're bad, but not to the same degree as refined carbohydrates. So the ultra processed carbohydrates, even if you get the same amount of carbohydrates, same amount of calories, it's the speed of the absorption that makes it a problem. And this applies to other things, right? So if you think about nicotine, smoking, why do you smoke alcohol? Well, because it delivers the nicotine directly into your lungs, which goes then directly into the blood vessels. So you get this big spike in the smoke, the nicotine, as opposed to if you were to use nicotine gum, for example. So you use nicotine gum because it's less addictive, right? Why? Because you're getting this more gradual rise in nicotine and then down, as opposed to a massive spike in nicotine up. Same thing with drugs, right? Why do you inhale cocaine? Why do you inject heroin directly into the veins? Because you want this massive spike that goes up. right? If you were to eat cocaine, might have an effect, but not as big an effect, right? And sometimes they use it for marijuana and stuff, right? You use edibles as opposed to smoking it because you want a sort of slower onset and offset. But the point is the same, right? Whether you're talking about glucose or whether you're talking about cocaine or nicotine, it's the same. The addictive effect is this big spike, right? The speed that it gets absorbed into the body plays a huge role in its physiologic effect, right? You can't just say that, well, nicotine is nicotine. It's the same thing, right? It's not the same thing. Smoking is different than nicotine gum. It just is, right?
And this is even applicable for people that are eating quote unquote healthy foods, like, say, paleo desserts based with almond flour, where the particle size has been changed mechanically, and then these other foods have been made, or a smoothie, where you're taking fruit and you're blending it
Absolutely.
up. So, highlight the importance here of looking at changes in the food and the particle size.
Yeah, so this is the important thing is that if you think about how we go from food to weight gain, everybody thinks it's food, calories, weight gain. No, that's simplistic and completely wrong. Like it's completely incorrect. So if you think it's just food, calories, weight gain, well, you've got a flawed model in your head. It's the food, right? Which is like, say, an apple, for example. You've got a certain number of calories, you've got a certain number of macronutrients, whatever. But then you have to take into account the next step, which is digestion. So you got to take that apple, you got to digest it. Digestion is what our body does to make it ready for absorption, which is the next step. So it goes into the stomach, it gets churned around, it gets mixed with stomach acid, and then it gets pushed out slowly into the small intestines. Because remember, the stomach acts as a reservoir, so it holds food there. Because when you're eating your meal, you're eating more at that time than you can absorb. So your body holds some of it, churns it around, mixes it all around, and then shoots out little pieces, boluses, to your small intestines. So it goes food, then digestion, then absorption. So absorption is where particle size might be important because if you have very, very fine particles like flour, so remember, flour, machine ground flour is very, very fine, right? You throw it up and it's like, it's the dust, right? So if you're using stone ground flour, for example, it's much heavier, much larger particles. And the difference is that your body doesn't absorb it as fast. So when you have small particles, absorption spikes up like this. When you have large particles, it's going to go slowly. When you have a lot of fiber, it's going to slow it down. So it goes food to digestion to absorption, which affects your hormones, which affects your hunger, satiety, which affects your eating behavior, which affects your weight, right? So it's a huge long chain. And every step of the way, there are ways that you can modify it, right? So you can modify the calories, but there's ways to modify the digestion, for example. There's because if you eat whole foods, it comes out of the body slow. It comes out of the stomach slower. So if you take the same food, and there's been such interesting studies, for example. So if you take an apple and you compare apple slices to apple puree, so applesauce, which is the same apple, you just bake it and puree it, right? So same number of calories, same number of carbs, same food. Everything is the same, but the baking and the pureeing has pre-digested that food, right? It's like baby food, right? So if you take that and you compare apple slices to applesauce, exact same ingredients, the physiologic effect is quite different. There's a much higher insulin effect. Your blood glucose spikes up much faster if you measure how quickly it exits the stomach. The apple slices takes about 65 minutes to exit the stomach, and the applesauce takes about 44 minutes. So much faster, coming out much faster for the same food. It's the digestion and absorption that has affected it. And because it affects the speed of absorption, it affects the insulin and the hormones. Because again, if you take those apple slices, remember, it's not coming out of the stomach so quickly. So it's going to keep your stomach more full for longer. So you're not going to want to eat later on. which is exactly what they found, of course. In the study, they found that, if you give people sort of an all-you-can-eat buffet after they gave these apples or applesauce, people ate less after they ate the apples. Right, so it's quite an interesting thing, because it's like there's so many steps. We know this because we spent, hundreds of years understanding human digestion and hormones and all that. And yet, when it comes to weight gain, we like to throw that all out the window and say, oh, food, calories, weight gain. It's like, well, what about all these other physiologic processes that make a huge difference in how our raw body responds to those foods, right? So the ultra processed foods, the speed of absorption, particle size, all of these things makes a difference. And if you ignore that, then you're going to you're going to lose a lot of the tools that we can use, like eating apples instead of applesauce. Smoothies actually are a very interesting thing, because if you actually if you take a smoothie and you blend in strawberries or passion fruit or raspberries, the absorption is actually slower. So where you think, oh, smoothies are bad for you, if you blend in like some passion fruit or seeded fruit, the absorption actually goes down like 20-30%. And it's because the blending actually breaks up the seeds, which contain a lot of fiber and polyphenols and all these other things, and actually slows down the absorption. So if you take a strawberry smoothie, for example, it may be better than your regular smoothie. And I think that the study they actually did was like mango versus mango plus passion fruit or something like that. And again, big difference when you blend those seeded fruits. So in some cases, the blending actually may help. In some cases, it will do worse, like apples versus applesauce.
I've heard Dr. Robert Lustig talk about blending and how that changes the structure of fiber, like you're talking about here with the seeds. But the way he explains it is that the insoluble forms a lattice, and then the soluble binds to that. And together, if the fiber is unchanged, that's when you slow digestion or absorption, actually. So that's
You
just
can
a little bit of nuance there onto what you just shared. There's obviously different scenarios where it's going to be impacted differently.
Yeah, and this is where understanding a little bit can be useful, because there are certain foods that form this sort of viscous layer and slows absorption, just like Dr. Lustig said. So sometimes it's the fiber, so that's fine. But fiber has actually multiple effects. So not just that, but also in some cases, like chia seeds, for example. You know how when you put chia seeds in water, it forms this sort of slimy duck, right? It's the same thing that happens in your body, but when you're forming this sort of viscous sort of slime, it's actually quite good. I actually love chia seeds, but it's sort of this viscous solid. Um, that also slopes absorption, because again, it sort of coats along the inside, and therefore, when you're trying to absorb other carbohydrates, it actually is slower, because it's got to make its way through this sort of viscous layer that the chia seed has actually created. So just like the fiber, how it can create this sort of the soluble, insoluble can sort of form this lattice that slows absorption. Other things can do the same thing. So again, it's important to understand these things, because these are all the nuances. Like when we try to simplify things and say it's just calories, you're losing all the nuance of these different foods. And that's why a lot of these, people say, oh, I took chia seeds and I did great. It's like, yeah, it's possible. It's definitely possible that you would do better using some of these foods. And I always think it's strange how we dumb it down to a single concept of calories and think that we're the most scientifically accurate representation of weight gain, when it's like crazy. It's like you've lost all the complexity of food science that we spent so long trying to sort of decode. And so, yeah, I think that certainly can play a role. But fiber is great. Chia seeds are great. Like blended fruits can be useful. You're still getting a lot of fructose in it, like, from the other stuff. So, but it's not the worst thing you could do.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
So we think that weight gain, weight loss is all about the individual, about willpower, and about calories. That's almost all wrong. Your body regulates body fat, sort of like a thermostat.